So we're at the start, as I said, of a new series of evenings over the coming months, and we're going to be co-creating this particular theme. So people getting involved, not just me. I think you probably all be sick of my sound of my voice by the end of it. So we're going to be co-creating a series of evenings based around some particular Buddha figures. And if Buddha figures is a thing you haven't really feel you have much affinity with or thought about very much or get in a particular way, I'm going to talk this evening a little bit about Buddha figures and try to sort of communicate something of what I think of their significance, of how we can relate to them, and maybe even where they originated. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of introduction to this sort of idea that we have of what you call archetypal Buddha figures. And we have the 5 Buddha figures in question arrayed on the shrine. I don't know if the people on Zoom can see the shrine. I guess they probably can't, can they? I get the camera. Will that mess everything up? You see the inside of my hand? Yeah, so I probably can't do any better than that, really, I'm afraid. But you'll be able to come in and see them. So they're actually 5 female Buddha figures, which I think makes a nice change, because a lot of the figures that we kind of consider, meditate on, bring to mind in our tradition are male. At least they manifest as male. So these particular Buddha figures are all female, and they're known as the 5 prajnas. And prajna means like transcendental wisdom. So each of them embodies a particular quality of Buddha wisdom, as well as many other things, many other qualities. And I was asked to kind of come up with the program for Sangha night for this term by Vajra Priya, who's away on solitary. And I'd gone into this material on the Buddha Field North Open Retreat, which Maggie was on. So I did a series of sessions on 4 of them, and I left one of them kind of sort of unspoken, because for reasons that will become clear during the course of these few weeks, it's quite difficult to talk about one of them really. I went into 4 of them over the course of 4 days, so I felt I had material ready, and why not do that material again? I found it really personally very significant. The sort of implications and the questions that arose around them felt very real to me, were kind of unfolding in real time. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity to bring this to the Shrewsbury Sangha. But it's quite a change of register, really, quite a change of tone to go into Buddha figures more specifically. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at them, giving presentations, but also performing devotional rituals, so performing pujas to each of them. Which again, puja is a territory that not everybody necessarily feels at home on. The idea of ritual and devotion is not something that that sits that easily necessarily with everybody, but we'll go into that as well as the course progresses. Yeah, so a distinct change of tone from the sort of conversations, wonderful that they have been, that we've been having over the past few weeks. And I thought it's probably a good idea, rather than making a bunch of assumptions and just launching straight into talking about Buddhas, is to sort of address the question of, well, what's going on here? What's this all about? Yeah, what's this all about when we're talking about Buddha figures? I mean, you can see there's an array of them here, and they're all different colours, and they're sitting on lotuses, and they've got auras and all sorts of colourful stuff happening. So you might understandably have questions about that. I mean, what's going on here? How am I supposed to relate to these figures? Are they real? Are they made up, or what are they? So that's what I'm going to go into a little bit this evening, or at least I'm going to try to shed some light on that if I can. Now, very uncharacteristically for me, I wrote this, which is not something I normally do. So strangely enough, I feel more nervous coming to you with a talk that I've written than with one that I haven't. than I would normally feel. But, you know, bear with me. Because I guess the ideas I'm trying to explore, they felt a bit more complex, and I needed to kind of reflect on them through writing. So, and it just sort of wrote itself. So if it feels like it's scripted, I'm afraid it is scripted. So please bear with me. I will try and look up every now and again. Okay. So the question I started with it when I was writing this talk was, what is it that brings people to Buddhism? Okay. It might be their desire to learn to meditate because you're stressed, or you're in pain, or you're dealing with anxiety, or you find that your mind is endlessly ruminating, that your mind never stops, never sits, never comes to stillness, which is something I hear a lot, you know, when I teach meditation classes. Or you might find that Buddhism offers a system of ethics that gives you a kind of moral compass. Yeah. And then that's an ethics based on the idea that we are basically the architects of our own suffering. Yeah. So when we act out of unwholesome motivations, what happens is that the result is pain and misery for us and for other people. Whereas if we act on the basis of kindness, empathy, and generosity, for instance, that makes us and other people happy. So maybe the idea of an ethical system where we have agency, where we can influence what happens to us, was attractive. Yeah. Or maybe you came along to something just out of idle curiosity and had a strong sense of the rightness of what you were introduced to, that you perhaps couldn't and even can't now fully articulate. And that was certainly the case for me. So when I walked through the doors of the Cambridge Buddhist Centre in 1993, I'd never been to anything Buddhist-y really. Well, actually, that's not quite true. I'd been to my brother's wedding at Theravada Monastery, a place called Chithurst in Sussex that some of you may know. Because my brother was a Buddhist before me, bless him, and that's how I got involved. And one of the first things I walked into was a puja, it was a devotional ritual, and I thought, I've got no idea what's going on here, but it's wonderful. Yeah, which is quite an unusual response, but not unheard of. Yeah, so went up and waved my incense with the best of them, just thought, yeah, this is really right. And it took a long time for me after that to start exploring what was behind it. So it was months before I started really finding anything out about the Dharma, about the Buddhist teachings. It was like a meditation, and that was fantastic. The people were fantastic. And that was enough for me at that time. Yeah. But in any way, I guess whichever way it goes, you've all found something sort of that makes rational sense to you. It's reasonable, what Buddhism teaches. Well, I presume it's reasonable and rational, because if it wasn't, you know, why would you be here? Yeah. And I think that is, of course, perfectly legitimate, because Buddhism does make rational sense on so many levels. Yeah. So it offers us a framework in which we can live our lives. Yeah. It offers us a philosophy that makes sense, practices and teachings that stand up to scrutiny and work for us in practice. And it can help us do everything from relax and improve our golf swing through to becoming better, more ethical and happier human beings. So far, so good. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You know, I've heard people say, I've not heard anything yet that doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, so far, so good. But then you get Buddha figures. All of a sudden, you're introduced to a completely sort of different dimension of Buddhism, like this one. So this is green Tara. As you can see, she's green. She's a green Buddha figure. In this case, she's a Buddha figure, not a Bodhisattva, which is a technicality for those of us who've been around for a while. Don't worry about it. Yeah, so she's a green Buddha. And I picked up green Tara because Lake referred to her last week in her wonderful conversation with Saravantu. And I was thinking at the time, I bet there are people here in this audience who don't know what's going on and who green Tara is, and what should I do with a green Buddha figure of either sex. Yeah. People aren't usually green, after all, unless they're either very, very seasick or doing Morris dancing. So what's that about? And there's the lotus, and there are the gestures and the implements that these figures hold. Yeah. So what does a green figure sitting on a lotus have anything to do with me? What am I supposed to make of it? So am I supposed to sort of worship her somehow, like a god? Or is she just a kind of something fictitious, you know, made up like the owl and the pussycat or Robin Hood? Yeah. And I know that some people have even felt disappointed or a bit betrayed when their rational and non-theistic Buddhism, so Buddhism that doesn't involve a god, suddenly throws up figures like this. It appears to become irrational. Yeah. And I remember I was leading a Buddhism course years back in the old place before we were here. And one of the people, one of the men on that course, who became a very steadfast friend of the center, said, once I'd recounted a certain aspect of the Buddha's life story that involved gods and weird stuff, he said, for the first time since I've been coming along, I feel really disappointed. And what he meant was that all of a sudden there was this kind of superstitious mumbo jumbo that had come into the mix. Yeah. After all of this really sensible and rational stuff. But he stuck around, as it turned out. Interesting. Yeah. So you might have felt at times, if this relates to you, like heading for the hills, heading for the exit, or just looking away, just putting it to one side and not thinking about it, which actually I think is a perfectly rational and reasonable strategy. So we always say, if you don't get it, park it. Yeah, it doesn't actually really matter that much. Yeah, if this stuff just kind of goes over your head or you don't know what you're supposed to do with it, you can just park it and come back to it later if you want. But what I'd like to try and do is make some sort of sense, as I understand it, of what's going on here. Yeah. But before I go on to Buddha figures and the like, yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the idea of rationality and irrationality. And I want to suggest there's actually a third element that kind of transcends both of them. So irrationality is fairly easy to spot, generally speaking. So believing without a shred of evidence, and in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, that our minds are controlled by an alien race of lizard people who live beneath the North Pole, which is what David Icke says, is irrational, right? Believing in spite of all of the science and all of the common sense that ingesting toxic bleach will cure COVID-19 just because somebody says it will, is irrational. Feeling that you need to turn around 3 times and spit when somebody mentions the name of the Scottish play in a theatre is irrational. On the other hand, believing that being nice to people is likely to make them and you happy is rational. Using a meditation technique that is proven to reduce stress is rational. Spending your time with nice people who will actually listen to you and meet you fully is rational. So Buddhism scores pretty highly in all of these areas. But it doesn't end there. I think that Buddhism, rather than just being rational, is something else. It's something that I would call, and I'm just going to introduce this one term, which I just made up, by the way. I think Buddhism is what I would call supra-rational. And by that, I mean that it takes in and includes rationality and goes beyond it. Okay, so it's not irrational. It doesn't deny rationality. So the Buddha, in many ways, was a deeply rational and sort of logical man. And he insisted on giving pragmatic advice and telling people to measure his teachings against their own experience. Yeah, so Buddhism makes full use of rationality, but it goes beyond it. And so to illustrate this, I'm actually going to use a couple of non-Buddhist examples, just as a sort of illustration. So one of them is a Bach mass, or any piece of music by J.S. Bach. Okay, I'm a great fan of J.S. Bach, by the way. So at a certain level, Bach's music is highly rational. Yeah, it's almost sort of mathematical in its kind of structures. And it's bound by the rationality of the musical system, which has its keys and its time signatures. Yeah, in which a discordant note is a discordant note, whatever you happen to think it should be. And yet, My experience is, if I'm sufficiently receptive, that it can transport me as the listener to a different dimension, a place of expansiveness, a place of beauty and power, dwelling in which leaves me feeling inspired, elated, and optimistic about the future of the human race. And this happens, I believe, because Bach's musical genius gave him access to this kind of realm, a realm of pure creativity and beauty. And his genius takes a sequence of notes, which has a sort of mathematical and rule-bound basis, and are subject to certain laws, and turns them into something transcendent, in the sense that what comes out is greater and more sublime than the sum of its parts. And I can't account for the effect of that on me rationally, but it doesn't mean that that experience is irrational. You know? So he's taken the rational process of producing music with its laws and its laws and rules, and gone beyond to produce something that is sublime, that is beautiful, that seems to belong to another dimension completely. So, and his genius introduces the listener to a realm of a different, higher order, my view. And that is what I would call the supra-rational about Bach's music. Or let's take the example of a medieval cathedral, right? So cathedrals that were built before the age of electricity and machines are an incredible, almost inconceivable feat of design and engineering. And I always find that, well, almost always find that being in them draws my spirit up, draws me up to a more elevated and expansive plane of being. So what went into building them in the first place? Well, on the one hand, if you were a medieval king, it no doubt made a lot of sense to build some kind of edifice to God to stop him from smiting your people and ruining your harvests, and to ensure your personal progression to heaven after death. So given the belief system of the time, that would be a perfectly rational thing to do. But I just don't think that accounts fully for the sheer beauty and richness of the buildings that arose in response to that. Cathedrals, well, many of them are just ridiculously, unapologetically beautiful and grandiose. And I can't help but think that they were somehow informed, not just by the architectural and structural engineering skills of those who built them, but also by their inspiration and faith. I feel that the designers and the architects must have been in touch with some kind of divine, sublime divine force. And I'm using the word divine very loosely here, from somewhere above and beyond their normal plane of being. Something more than just superstition. And to me, that's reflected in the atmosphere you find in cathedrals to this day. So I would say the cathedrals were the product of both rational and super-rational concerns. And then you get art and poetry. So William Blake apparently once said that while lots of people would see the sun as a sort of flat yellow disc about the size of a guinea, when he looked at the sun, he saw a choir of angels singing, "Holy, holy, holy." You know? And I don't think this meant he was just, off his rocker. I think it meant that he was in touch with the visionary realm of archetypal beauty and significance. Lucky him. So in the same way, Buddhism has its symbols and myths that go beyond the purely rational. And this is ultimately, of course, because the experience of awakening includes, but also goes beyond, totally beyond the purely rational. And to make some sort of sense of this, we have to go back 2,500 years to the time of the Buddha and to the period immediately after his death. Okay, so in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, nobody quite knows when, you have a man in northern India who has gone through an experience so radically transformative that he can't communicate it directly and fully because words simply aren't up to the job. A man who sat down under a tree, who was, when he sat down under the tree, still pretty much like the rest of us, subject to the fundamental delusion that he had a fixed separate and eternally unchanging self within him that needed to be protected from the world of fixed, separate, and eternally unchanging things and people outside him, in a way that caused immeasurable pain and suffering to everyone involved. But the man who got up from under that tree, days, weeks later, who knows, was unimaginably transformed. He completely seen through this illusion of fixed, permanent things in the world, including himself, and now saw reality as it was. A constant process of flux, with nothing fixed or permanent anywhere within it. And his consciousness, for want of a better word, had entered a completely unsayable and ungraspable realm of being. So ungraspable, in fact, that even to call it a realm of being falls woefully short of the mark. Simply put, there is no way for words and concepts to communicate that experience. Like the finger, but the Buddha had no option other than to use words and concepts, because that's all that was available to him. It's like the famous finger pointing at the moon in the Zen saying. And those words and concepts became the teachings, the formulated Dharma. All those lists we know and love, like the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Paths and the Six Perfections and so on. They became the rational framework for living a better life that many people are still drawn to. But the fact remains that they emerged from an experience that transcended words and concepts in its majesty, beauty, and meaning. But the people around the Buddha who became his disciples, and some of them themselves becoming awakened, they had a significant advantage over the rest of us now, that they had the actual person of the Buddha with them, the living and breathing exemplar of awakening. So according to the scriptures, his simple presence, let alone the words he used, could have a profound impact on the people he met. In many cases, causing them simply to put down their previous lives and follow him on the spot, or even to become highly spiritually attained just by listening to his words. That would be great. Would that it was so easy. Not everyone was affected like that, of course. There's the famous story of the wanderer who ate rose apples, who met the Buddha shortly after his awakening, asking the Buddha who he was, and the Buddha said, "I am a Buddha, you know, I'm the foremost being in the universe with unrivaled insight and wisdom." And the wanderer just basically said the equivalent of, "Yeah, whatever," and just wandered off. Yeah? So it didn't affect everyone. But for many people, their lives were permanently transformed. Some of his followers took to bringing him to mind, even when they weren't with him. And the most famous of these is a guy called Pingya, who appears in a collection of Buddhist scriptures called the Sutta Nipata, who tells his Brahmin friend that he is never separated from Gautama, which is the Buddha's family name, because he constantly visualizes him when he's not with him, and sort of bathes in his compassion and wisdom and inspiration. Yeah, and this is a practice. This became a practice. This is what people did. A practice called Bidanu Sati, or the recollection of the Buddha. And it's still practiced quite widely in derived forms in our order, but more of that. But one day, of course, the Buddha died. His human body had become like a broken down cart held together with string. And he went the way of all flesh and passed away. When he died, he entered into what is known as the parinirvana. So you've heard of the term nirvana, which is full awakening. Parinirvana means full awakening without remainder. Yeah, which is an interesting thing. So the remainder in this case is everything. Yeah, so his form, his sort of feelings, pleasant, painful, and neutral, his physical, his mind, his volitions, everything that we identify with being us, was the remainder that was put down. And then whatever was left after that, which is completely mysterious, passed into this kind of unspeakable dimension of full enlightenment. Yeah. So the Buddha's true enlightened essence was kind of somehow left over from putting everything else down and passed beyond our ken into a state of boundless freedom and great bliss, so the scriptures tell us. But many of his followers were distraught because he was no longer with them. So what were they to do? the light had gone out of the world. But there were a few things that they could and did do. So one of them was to memorize and faithfully pass on his teachings, which became the basis of early school Buddhism. Another was to build sort of religious devotional objects, reliquaries to him, some of which contained his actual physical remains, so stupas, which you find in many Buddhist countries in the East. And they became objects of worship. Another was to practice his teachings as faithfully as possible, especially his ethical code. And yet another was to meditate on him. So just as people had done during his lifetime, like Pingia, they could meditate on him after his death. Yeah. So maybe they would bring the actual Buddha to mind. Maybe they'd met him and known him. They could bring his form to mind, his person to mind, and just express devotion to him that way. And this is where I think our archetypal Buddhas and Bodhisattvas come onto the scene. So I just have this picture of the disciples of the Buddha and disciples of those disciples sitting down to meditate as the Buddha did, bringing him to mind, like Pingu, with hearts and minds full of devotion. And as they did so, they might become very concentrated indeed, as the Buddha did on the night of his awakening. Okay. So concentrated that they left behind the world of the gross senses and entered into amazing superconscious states, free of the constrictions of the physical body and the senses. So states in which that habitual sense that we all have of me in here and everything else out there sort of increasingly disappeared. And those of you who've been around a bit and know a bit about meditation, of course, I'm talking about the dhyanas, the superconscious states. And by the way, they're accessible to any serious meditator, so I'm reliably informed. So they're characterized by the complete absence of hindrances, the absence of negativity, the absence of smallness, of rigidity of any kind, and by spaciousness, by light, by ease, by an experience of a consciousness that is somehow infinite in nature. And any of us can have at least a taste of this experience of just when we emerge from a deep meditation or go on retreat for a while, if we're lucky. And what I think happened was that over time, some of these meditators started to encounter figures in their meditation. Yeah? Figures made of light, figures of a certain color, maybe like these, yeah? Maybe holding particular implements and seated on lotuses. And it seems that different meditators sort of shared the similar experiences, almost as if these figures were somehow imprinted on a collective unconscious, like a Jungian archetype. And I don't think they were making them up. I don't think they were just imagining them, and you know, like you or I might make something up. What I think was happening was that the meditators' consciousness and awareness was so clarified and so exalted that they were actually capable of coming into contact with emanations of the awakened mind itself. Yeah. And these emanations, in the form of these figures, were somehow symbolic of enlightened qualities like wisdom and compassion. In other words, they kind of came to a sort of interface between our normal unenlightened mind and the enlightened mind, wherever that happens to be. Yeah. So there's a description in the scriptures of the Buddha, which is quite nice actually, of the Buddha being like a mother hen who is tapping on the outside of the eggshells to encourage the chicks inside the eggs to hatch. And there's no prizes for guessing who the chicks are. Yeah, the chicks are us. Okay, so I like to think of it a bit like that. And so these meditators were had reached this sort of point where the Buddha, the enlightened mind, was sort of trying to communicate with them, sort of tapping on the eggshell of their consciousness, if you like. And that Buddha, that was coming from this mysterious dimension beyond concept and reason that the Buddha had passed away into. And that's how I think over time that all of these archetypal Buddha and Bodhisattva figures arose. So an interface between the unawakened mind and the awakened mind. Yeah, don't worry, park that if you think, well, yeah, you can ask the questions later on and try and answer them. So in Buddhism, we have a rational path. yeah, distilled into rational teachings from the Buddha's awakened experience. But we also have something that goes beyond the rational, without denying it. Those mysterious encounters with archetypal figures in the depths of meditation. So you might find that a bit weird, or off-putting, or you might find that interesting and exhilarating, even. Yeah, as I say, if it's a bit much for you, just sort of park it and maybe come back to it later. Yeah, there's plenty of really good and valuable stuff to be getting on with just in the rational. Don't worry too much about the supra-rational. But if you're interested, or at least a little bit interested in pursuing this in the coming weeks and months, the question arises of what we can do with this stuff practically. Yeah, well, most of us are not visionary meditators after all, who meet Buddhas and Bodhisattvas on a regular basis. I know I'm not. But some of us do have a positive relationship with them all the same. Even if we don't have direct visionary access to these realms, we can still experience something of their power and beauty by approaching the figures from the perspective of our everyday consciousness. We can say, okay, so I'll listen to Akasharaja and other people talking about them, suspend my disbelief, and be open to the possibility that something supra-rational, something of value may be communicated. So some of you will know that order members are usually initiated into visualization practices. So you get given a Buddha or Bodhisattva figure that you kind of visualize, you bring to mind in the same way, bringing them to mind in meditation in whatever way works for you. Some people can visualize really well. Like, it's a bit like you draw a picture postcard on the back of your eyelids, so to speak. Other people struggle, other people can't do that quite as easily, and I'm one of them. But when I'm doing my practice, at least much of the time, we'll get some sort of sense of the felt presence of this figure in my awareness by just dwelling on it. And the Buddhist tradition tells us that what we turn our minds towards, that is what we can become. So if we turn our mind towards a figure that represents compassion, represents generosity, abundance, fearlessness, or wisdom, then our mind will develop those qualities. Yeah. And Surita, who's a senior member of our order, once said that doing a practice like that, that's sort of spending time with a Buddha or Bodhisattva, is a bit like holding up a lightning rod in a storm. Yeah, you do your part of it, you create the image, and then if you're lucky, that lightning rod gets zapped from somewhere else, and that figure then becomes brought to life. It becomes filled with energy and brilliance and a life of its own. Like a kind of pact, in a way. So I'll visualize you, and you come along and bless me. And sometimes that works out, and I like that idea a lot. So sometimes when I'm doing my practice, I just get a sense of something informing that practice that isn't my own doing. Yeah? That sense of whatever it is tapping on the eggshell of my consciousness, trying to get me to wake up. So if we can approach these figures with an open mind, something like that may happen. Yeah? So this series is going to involve presentations, meditation, conversations, and ritual. And there'll also be practical elements, hopefully, things that you can take away and try out. But what I really hope is that you're prepared to come along this journey with me and see where it ends up. Thank you.